Sports Reference is one of the most popular sports websites on the internet. They get a lot of page views and they're featured in the New York Times, used as a reference by Bleacher Report, CBS, The Ringer, ESPN, and pretty much every major sports media company. Sports Reference provides the most basic and the most complex stats you could possibly want across its multiple websites for all the major sports. We now welcome the president of Sports Reference, Sean Forman. Sean, it's a pleasure to have you on. How is social distancing treating you?
Well, I'm a computer programmer, so it's not any different than normal for me. So it's going all right so far. So we closed our office probably 3 weeks ago, and people have been working from home. So we're doing all right. I hope everybody out there is doing all right as well.
Yeah, we are. We're just going strong with our podcast, trying to keep it going. So, for our listeners that aren't familiar with the background of your company, can you give us some of the insight on how Sports Reference got started?
Sure. It's. I'll try to give you the short version. It's a pretty long story. I've been doing
Oh,
the
well,
site
we have
now.
time.
Been doing the site now for 20 years. I started it while I was in graduate school, kind of as a PhD thesis avoidance project. And I'd always been into sabermetrics and been really into fantasy baseball. That was kind of the thing that started it off. And late 1990s, mid to late 1990s, I got into web design, which was a very different thing then than it is now, and was really interested in it. And I kind of tied the two together. I was in a extremely serious fantasy baseball league. I want to say probably launched in like 1995 or so, where there was an entrance interview actually to get into the league. I had to name like 18 different closers from around the league or something like that. And so I was in this league and I was looking for edges, and minor league prospects were an area where I thought I can get an edge. So I started putting together these reports for minor league players: Andrew Jones, Bobby Abreu, Vlad Guerrero. All this is making me feel very old now, but those were minor leaguers when I was starting. And so I put together projections to try and figure out who were going to be the best players. And I started publishing those projections online, started doing web design, and that kind of led eventually to working with the book, and finally the initial site Baseball Reference in 2000. So I did that part time for about 6 years, started doing it full time, quit my job as a math professor, doing it full time, which would have been, I think, spring of 2006. And then we just kind of grown organically from there. We Football and basketball were fairly early ads by people I knew and worked with. And then slowly grown the site over that. Now we're up to 11 full-time employees.
That's really awesome. We're all big fans of the website. We use it for our research for the show and for our YouTube videos. We love what you guys do. And as teams become more and more analytics based across really all the major sports, do you buy into that thinking that you can build a team around analytical data? And if so, like what data would you use personally?
Well, I mean, it all depends on which sport we're talking about. I think you can definitely. I mean, I always kind of everybody's constantly says we need to combine, scouting and analytics, and that's certainly true. It's almost become a cliche though to hear the GMs, talk about that. But um, that's definitely the case. I think the analytics can show you who are players who have played well, and who are players maybe likely to improve based on their age and their statistics so far. But it can be very hard to kind of discern like who are players who are being misused in their current settings, or who are players who have skills who maybe can when you move them into a new setting they'll thrive, or into a new system they'll thrive under that system. So those are the kinds of things where analytics can kind of get at most of those cases, or help with those cases. I think kind of as a first cut, But if you're really serious, I think there's gonna be more than just looking at a spreadsheet, or looking at a sports reference stat page.
Well, Sean, you've been running this site for about 20 years now, you said. What would you say your most validating experience is with Sports Reference?
My parents thought I was kind of crazy to quit being a math professor and doing this full time, and it wasn't until I got interviewed on XM radio, where they could actually hear me be interviewed, that I think it became something that was worthwhile in their regard. I I don't know. I've been very lucky, and there are a number of different things along the line, along the way that have been really interesting. I'd say probably, one kind of early on, we were working with the Baseball Hall of Fame. They have an exhibit at Cooperstown that will show you the league leaders, the career or active leaders for a wide variety of stats for any moment in history. So if pretend you had Baseball Reference open in 1972, it would show you who the batting average all-time home run leaders were in 1972 based on the stats. And so we worked with them, produced the data for that. We're still producing it for them. And so they had an opening reception for the exhibit, and Cal Ripken was there, and the president of the Hall of Fame introduced me to him, and mentioned I ran Baseball Reference. Said, oh yeah, I emailed you guys like a couple months ago because I was looking for something for a broadcast I was doing, and I had not heard that. I did not realize that had happened, and so I got back to the office and I asked her, a guy who does our user affairs, did Cal Ripken email you a couple months ago? And he was, oh yeah, we I answered his question, it was fine. And we on the spot implemented a policy that any Hall of Famers emailing the site, I have to know about it right away. And so it was, just finding out that people in the industry are using it is always something that I enjoy hearing.
So, as a former math professor, you're obviously a guy who's really good with numbers. How did that transfer over into the initial forming of the website? And can you give us some insight as to how the site actually works and in terms of how you guys track data and keep it updated?
Sure. So I would say the site has a little. I'm not using a whole lot of we're not using a whole lot of advanced math when we do stuff on the sports reference sites. But what we do when I first got into web design and computer science, I was very interested in how to make things usable for the users, and there were a lot of resources that I read and books that I read on along those lines. And so I'd say the thing that's kind of served us the best over the last 20 years is that we use the site ourselves, every day and in multiple different ways. But we always try to take a viewpoint of what would our user want and what kind of question is the user asking and what answer are they looking for. And so how can we most easily, get them along that path so that they can answer the questions that they have. And I think anytime you have kind of a user-centered viewpoint, it's going to serve you well, and I think it's definitely served us well. Um, I'm blanking on the second part of your question there, but yeah, like I said, I think serving your users well has always been something that will work in terms of being a business.
So one way that, in at least one of my favorite ways that you create user accessibility on the website is the simple rating system calculation. Can you take
Hmm.
us into that a little bit and how that
Sure.
formed and how it works?
Yeah, that might be the most mathematical thing on the site. So one of our co-owners, and he actually created the football site originally, Doug Drennan, is a math professor at Sewanee, the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, and he is very interested in rating systems. And so early on, we had this simple rating system, and really, it's basically you set up a large matrix with the teams. And with the teams with each team on the left, and then you have a matrix that represents each game between each of the teams, with the team rankings being part of the entries there. And so you're basically minimizing the root mean square error of your ranking systems. And so that's not a great explanation, but basically it's trying to balance out what the strength of the schedule is for the team, along with what the rankings of each of the teams are versus the margin of victory for those games. And so, obviously, if you have a team and it's centered around zero, so it's based on zero as an average league average team, more or less. And so we use that across all of the sites. I think it works. Like I said, it's simple, so it's not necessarily. I wouldn't use it necessarily to gamble heavily because there are probably more sophisticated ranking systems. It also doesn't take into account anything like, was Steph Curry injured this year, and so if he's back, the Warriors are going to be a lot better than they were when they were accruing all these negative rankings. Um, and so it's a first cut, and so that's why we try to put it in the title. It's a simple rating system. It's so simple. There's no one person that you can point to who created it because it's a fairly common system across a number of different scientific areas. But it's served us pretty well, and I think as a kind of as an initial viewpoint, I think it's sufficient for showing you who's a good team and who's not a good team, because it handles all of those cases with strength of schedule and margin of victory that kind of get lost in some of the other stats.
Okay, so you mentioned sports gambling. So that's something that is newly legal in the United States. How are
Mhm.
you guys planning to evolve to cater to that? As a lot of users might be using your website in order to help place their bets.
Yeah, we're certainly aware of that. We get a from different sports books and people in that industry, wanting to work with us because we obviously have a very large audience of very numerate and hopefully intelligent users on our site who may be interested in that sort of thing. I'd say we're still kind of waiting and seeing. I mean, the current affairs have kind of slowed everything down for everybody in that regard. It's still, I think, only five, maybe six states are have actual legal online gambling right now. I think, for us, we have never really taken a fantasy specific viewpoint or a gambling specific viewpoint. We do have a few tools on the site. So I think it's more about, we've done a lot of user research. We've talked to a number of users who are kind of serious gamblers and what they're looking for. So it's really about putting together tools. We have play index tools on each of the sites that give you a more advanced look. We'll probably be looking at putting some more detailed tools on there that people can subscribe to and maybe get an edge using those tools.
All right, Sean, one last question for you. Besides for the stuff you just mentioned, is there anything we can be expecting in the future for the sports reference websites?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the thing I'd mention most right now is we have email newsletters that we send out on a regular
I
basis.
love those
Obviously,
personally. I look forward to
yeah,
those every morning.
yeah. So we're still running them through the downtime when where no games are being played. We're currently on baseball. We're highlighting like the past. Today I think we sent out the all time best performances on April 10th historically and things like that. So we're continuing to run some of those, but in season we kind of highlight what's happened the night before, what you might expect the next day. Very, very few people subscribe to newspapers these days, so we're kind of trying to treat it as like what the agate box scores in the newsletter might have told you if in looking at them for a minute or two every morning. So that's what we're shooting for with the newsletter. So as part of that, those are called StatHead. That's at stathead.com. We're relaunching our Play Index tools onto stathead.com as new subscription features that we're having there. And so those will probably go live. Baseball is probably next week, actually, baseball will be available for free there for everybody to try out. So that'll be stathead.com/baseball. And I would guess at the latest by the end of next week, that'll be available to people to look at. So we'll have that, and then soon after that, we'll be rolling out hockey and basketball and pro football in colleges as well. So, those are kind of the big thing that we're working on at this point.
Sean, we're huge fans of the website, big fans of the work you guys do. Keep it up. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.